My name is Sarah Brown-Campello, and I'm the Network and Programs Coordinator here at WINGS. WINGS is a global network of over 100 philanthropy associations and support organizations in over 40 countries around the world, and our purpose is to strengthen, promote, and provide leadership on the development of philanthropy and social investment. Our vision is of a strong global philanthropic community that strives to build more equitable and just societies around the world. Today's webinar was facilitated by WINGS and will present speakers from CAF America, the Arab Foundation Forum, and Indiana University's Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. The philanthropic sector has grown rapidly and become an important actor in global development. However, philanthropic institutions are facing challenging markets and restrictive regulatory changes worldwide. We have an expert here with us today to discuss the global trends of shrinking space for civil society by, one, looking at the key findings of the 2018 Global Philanthropy Environment Index, and two, by exploring the changing philanthropic environment from various regional perspectives. On the screen, you'll see our four presenters today. We have Naila Faruqi, based in Cairo, Egypt. We have Kinga Horvath and Uno Silly, based in Indiana University in the USA, and Jessie Kraft, based in Washington, D.C. All these women work globally and have extensive experience with cross-border giving in different contexts. Our first speakers come from the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. The school faculty and staff train and empower students and practitioners to innovate and lead, and to create positive and lasting change in the world. They increase the understanding of philanthropy and improve its practice worldwide through critical inquiry, research, teaching, training, and civic engagement. To start, I would like to introduce to you Una and Kinga from the Lilly Family School. They will be talking about their report, Global Philanthropy Index, as well as highlight some interesting cases from around the world. Thank you for joining us, Kinga and Una. And I'm going to bring up your presentation, and you can tell me when to switch the slides.
Thank you to all of you who have joined us from all over the world. I think this is a really exciting opportunity to talk about the findings from our Global Philanthropy Environment Index. Today's focus of our presentation is the Global Philanthropy Environment Index, and I think all of you will agree that its findings could not be more timely or more relevant. The report was released earlier this year and comes alongside a series of unprecedented natural disasters, a global refugee crisis, and a growing concern about migration in many parts of the world. We also have ongoing needs in healthcare, education, arts and culture, that government and markets alone cannot solve. What we know today is that philanthropy plays a vital role in solving problems, and right alongside the UN summit earlier last week, actually, more emphasis on the role that philanthropy can play in meeting these sustainable development goals. From the beginning, we knew that, understood that the Global Philanthropy Environment Index would need to be a one-of-a-kind resource for people around the world, and we worked with a team of regional reviewers, country experts, and funders, as well as our advisory council, to actually set the stage for this research. So I just want to say thank you to all those that worked with us from around the world, and to emphasize that the research that we'll be presenting today, the Global Philanthropy Environment Index, looks at how country policies are conducive to philanthropy, both domestically and internationally, and helps fill in the gap to better understand the factors that can improve or hold philanthropy back domestically and internationally. And actually the goal is to disseminate this knowledge so that everyone understands just what role philanthropy can play and what role governments and civil society leaders can play in increasing philanthropy globally. Next slide, please. So right in front of you, you'll see a world map, and what we've tried to do is highlight the 79 economies that are featured in this year's report. This Global Philanthropy Environment Index covers 79 countries and economies and represents 81.2% of the world's population. Included in this year's report are 20 for economies that are emerging markets, and we worked with more than 100 country level and regional level advisors and experts. All of the economies covered actually span all the continents. So we have covered both North America, South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, you can see Asia, Europe, as well as Australia. And importantly, one of the really exciting pieces of the release is that we're able to add countries in the developing world that were not part of the report previously when it was published under the auspices of the Hudson Institute. So the last time this report was released, we've expanded the countries to at least an additional 20 countries are covered. So now that you've seen the scope of the work geographically, the next slide, we're going to talk about what the index actually measures and the stages that we use in producing the report. So because of the comprehensive nature of the work, we start with a country expert questionnaire. It's a very extensive questionnaire that covers various aspects of philanthropy in a particular country. We have an initial review with the research team, as well as a regional review. At the final stage, an advisory board is involved to actually look at all the country expert reports alongside other reports, and then we emerge at a final score for each country, which gets us to what does the index actually entail. On the next slide, you will see the key findings from the Global Philanthropy Environment Index, and let's just go on to talk about what those findings are. We find, and this is just a quick summary of the results, I think the main takeaway is that we find in about 40% of the economies that we study, the overall environment is still quite restrictive around philanthropy. We find that the political conditions in many parts of the world remain one of the most challenging constraints that philanthropy faces, and that many countries have increased restrictions on cross-border flows. And this comes at a time when they're increasing societal needs, both at the country level and often at the regional level. And so highlighting that countries appear to be restricting philanthropic flows in an environment where those needs are quite urgent is something worth mentioning. Finally, we do have evidence that in some parts of the world there has been an overall improvement in the regulatory environment. So 6 out of the 11 regions that we study actually have seen an improvement in regulatory conditions. Next slide, please. Just to give you a sense of the 40%, you can see what we try to do is instead of just dividing the world into restrictive versus non-restrictive environments, we've tried to highlight the complexity that exists. In about 60% of the world's population, conditions are quite favorable to philanthropy. But you can see that those range from moderately favorable to highly favorable. And similarly, when we look at the restrictions placed on philanthropy, we also see quite a variation in the range of restrictions that exist. All right, now before I turn it over to Kinga, my colleague, to walk you through the country examples, I wanted to do a bit of a deeper dive to bring you behind the scenes into what the index actually captures. The very first component of the index is the ease of operating an organization. The second is tax incentives, the laws and regulations that govern both giving and receiving donations, as well as domestically. This is a bit of a complex issue because some countries have tax incentives and some do not, and we'll talk about that as we go through the country examples. Number 3, another really important area that I think many of you on the webinar will be interested in, cross-border flows. Cross-border flows have received a lot of attention recently because, as we mentioned, many countries around the world have imposed or are considering imposing laws and regulations that govern giving and receiving donations across borders. The political environment is one that we're paying close attention to, and that refers to governance and relations between government and philanthropic organizations. And then a new part that we added in 2018 for the first time is looking at the sociocultural environment, including how culture, how history, and how organizational level attributes influence philanthropic traditions around the world. With that as an overview, I just want to mention very quickly that we see a range around the world with some of the highest scores in Northern and Western Europe, as well as in the United States and Canada, and some of the lowest scores in the Middle East, but also low scores in Central Asia and the South Caucasus area. By presenting these scores, we offer countries and regions an opportunity to see how they benchmark against other parts of the world, but also opportunities for improvement. Particularly in many parts of the world, there's increasing scrutiny on the ease of running businesses. It's interesting that there has not been that scrutiny on how the ease of operating a philanthropic organization. And this data is meant to highlight the constraints that civil society and funding organizations may face in simply just operating a foundation or a nonprofit or an NGO. And so you can also see there that these scores do actually exhibit a great deal of variation. Where we see another area where we see quite a bit of variation across different regions and countries on the next slide is the tax incentive component. Latin America is actually quite low in terms of providing tax incentives, and that includes incentives that are offered to corporations, individuals, as well as other entities. In some parts of the world, there has been innovation in this. As you may recall, India passed the CSR law a few years back that offers tax incentives for corporations. So this is an area of a lot of interest because there has been a significant policy shift in many parts of the world. Moving to the next slide, just want to mention cross-border flows because that's an area where Europe performs quite well, but we did get quite a bit of pushback as we discussed these results with European researchers and policymakers because they also see room for improvement in the European cross-border flows dimension. The political environment is one where there is significant room for growth. Here we do see many countries where the political environment is actually one of the biggest obstacles to the growth of philanthropy. In governments, alongside these results, we know that governments in both developed and developing countries are recognizing the role that the philanthropic sector can play. And new tools, crowdfunding, impact investing, are beginning to be used in many parts of the world. So the barrier being the political environment represents something that I think all of us can certainly grapple with. And then finally, as we move over to Kinga, I want to mention kind of a surprise and a bit of an interesting finding from the report is that the sociocultural environment exhibits the least variation across countries and regions. We see that around the world, there's an overwhelming interest in philanthropy and that philanthropy is embedded in cultures and religions and sociocultural environments around the world. And this represents, I think, a reason for all of us to be very optimistic because alongside the most challenging environments, we also see the greatest interest in philanthropy and increasing use and adoption of many of the new tools that we have already highlighted, whether it's crowdfunding, impact investing, or even the rise of social enterprises in many parts of the world. So with that as an overview, I'm going to turn it over to Kinga to take us through a few of the country level examples.
Yes, thank you, Una, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. On this slide, you can see the correlation between GDP per capita and the scores of the Global Philanthropy Environment Index. And we can see that the GPEI scores are positively linked to GDP per capita. So as we will discuss the country examples, it's also important to think about the economic freedom and development of the country's economy that can influence philanthropy. So if we go to the next slide, please. You can see that the 79 economies show a very mixed group in terms of regulations that affect the philanthropic sector. First, we would like to mention some general examples of regulations that positively affect the philanthropic sector. Could you please, yes, see the next slide. So we identified some changes that brings new opportunities for philanthropy, such as simplifying the registration process or repealing laws that monitored or controlled philanthropic organizations. And several countries showed that they improved the tax incentives for giving, supporting both individuals and corporations to give and donate for philanthropic organizations. On the next slide, you can see some of the examples for restrictive regulatory changes. So, as Una mentioned earlier, several countries tighten the management of foreign donations and strictly monitor or restrict cross-border donations. Other countries require public fundraising credentials for philanthropic organizations to fundraise and collect donations. And we can see that overall the anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism laws might also negatively affect and restrict the impact of philanthropic organizations. And now we would like to highlight three countries, Hungary, Nigeria, and Venezuela, from different regions of the world, to dive deep into the changing philanthropic environment and see how important the narrative and the qualitative components of this index are. So on the next slide, you can see the scores of Hungary, which is part of the Eastern and Southern European region. You can see that in almost all indicators, Hungary scored lower than the regional average. And philanthropic organizations might face several challenges in Hungary. As an example, in 2017, the government enacted the new law on the transparency of foreign funded organizations that puts a label and onerous burdens on philanthropic organizations that receive more than approximately $28,000 per year from foreign sources. You can see also that the political environment in Hungary scored very low, mainly because the government created a hostile environment for international organizations, especially human rights and advocacy watchdog organizations in the country. And also because the space for philanthropic organizations participating in policymaking processes has been shrinking since 2014. However, it's also important to mention that there are several positive conditions in Hungary that can support philanthropy and increase the enabling environment for philanthropy. Just mention some examples to show how diverse the philanthropic environment is. The registration of philanthropic organizations is free of charge in Hungary, and there are various tax exemptions available for these organizations. And as Una mentioned earlier, the socio-cultural component is very important. And for example, in Hungary, the public trust, even though the political environment is hostile in the country, is relatively high, and the public is aware of the role and importance of philanthropy. The next example on the following slide is Nigeria from Sub-Saharan Africa. You can see that Nigeria scored relatively low in terms of tax incentives, again, cross-border flows and political environment. However, the socio-cultural environment and the importance of indigenous traditions of philanthropy shows the high score in this country. Nigeria, just as Hungary, has some restrictions on cross-border donations, and the reporting requirements of such donations is burdensome. Indeed, if the NGO Regulatory Commission bill was enacted, it might lead to further restrictions on foreign-funded philanthropic organizations. Additionally, as the scores show, the government prohibits the operation of any philanthropic organizations with same-sex related missions, and the government doesn't offer tax benefits for individual charitable donations. So that's the reason that both the tax incentives and the political environment scores are quite low. However, again, we identified some positive changes and positive conditions that could lead to a more enabling environment in Nigeria. The institutionalized philanthropy is growing in this country, and the social entrepreneurships as a new and innovative way for philanthropy has experienced a growth and recognition across the Nigerian society. And finally, we thought that we will briefly discuss a South American country, which is Venezuela. You can see on the next slide that Venezuela scored very low in terms of ease of operating a philanthropic organization, cross-border flows, and also political environment. But again, something similarly what we saw with Nigeria, the socio-cultural environment score is very high because in the country, the Christian and other cultural traditions are very strong and supportive for philanthropy. However, as I mentioned, three indicators shows challenges for philanthropic organizations. The government restricted both political and economic freedoms in the country and initiated several investigations of certain type of philanthropic organizations. And additionally, as we can see in terms of the ease of operating a philanthropic organization indicator, the government has made it difficult to form certain type of organizations and severely restricted cross-border donations. So to summarize these three countries and summarize what we saw in the overall, what we see in the overall report, we can see that cross-border donations have been challenged in several countries, strictly monitored or restricted. However, we are in the time when global philanthropy is more important than ever before. But it also reminds us that the socio-cultural environment and the new technology like crowdfunding and social entrepreneurships can bring new opportunities for global philanthropy. So thank you much. We would like to thank you again to our funders who made this index possible. And I'd like to give back the presentation to Sarah. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Zuna and Kinga. For the people on this webinar, we'll send you a list of resources that will include the report that they came out with. And remember, throughout this webinar, you can send us questions that you might have for the presenters using the chat box, and we can ask them on your behalf. Our next speaker comes from CAF America, which is a global grant-making organization assisting corporations, foundations, and individuals streamline the grant-making process to eliminate risk and administrative burden. Through their work, they help donors support great causes by assisting them in making strategic, effective, and tax-advantaged grants internationally and domestically. So without further ado, we have Jessie Kraft from CAF America. She and her organization have extensive experience helping donors give across borders and to challenging environments. Thank you, Jessie, for being with us here today. I'm going to now switch the slides to you.
Great, thank you so much. Can you hear me all right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. Let's see, go to the next slide. Okay, so just to start, I want to give just a bit of context on who we are. As Sarah mentioned, we are an intermediary grant maker, and we work with donors of all types in the United States, so corporations, foundations, and individuals that want to give internationally. So we really focus in that role on regulatory compliance. So compliance not only with the laws and framework in the U.S., but also assisting the charities on the recipient end in complying with their local laws, which is where our expertise comes in as far as this presentation, as well as risk management on behalf of our donors and reputation protection. So that's just a little bit of context of where we're coming from. So today, I'm focusing specifically on 2 case studies, both of which are mentioned in the Lilly Schools report that you just heard about, and is an amazing resource that kind of helps ground us and help us understand some of the challenges in the countries they researched. So thank you guys very much for producing that amazing report. So China is, of course, there's a lot of references in that report to China, and as many of you know, there have been several changes in the legal context in China over the last really year and a half, 2 years now, that affect our ability to give foreign donations into China from the U.S. as well as the rest of the world sending money into China for philanthropic purposes. So China scored there on that second to lowest rating on the Global Environment Index, which really speaks to some of the environment there in this regard. And over the past several years, China has seen increased measures to ensure national security on many levels, and there's been really a drive to create more centralized policies there in China. And so this has, come to fruition in this regard through crackdowns on activists, so environmental and human rights, et cetera, activists that started after this. They've been there and present, but really have gained momentum through these pushes towards national security and policy centralization. But ultimately, this is the kind of political force that moved us towards the overseas NGO law that we saw come into place in January 2017. So really, this law in a lot of ways stems from China's concern about foreign influence and their view that they needed to more highly regulate the influence of foreign funding coming in to support nonprofit and charity work in their country. So basically, there are a couple things that happened when this law came into place. One of which is that the NGO sector has been now placed under the supervision of the Ministry of Public Security, rather than the Ministry of Civil Affairs, which is where it was housed before that. And that's significant because the Ministry of Public Security is essentially the police force of the country. So it really raises the stakes and makes compliance and that focus on national security more real. So I think that's a significant move in this law. Second, what it does is it really creates 2 ways for foreign donors to give into China. And through both of these ways, the overall premise of this law is so that China has oversight and approval authority over all of the foreign projects that are happening in their country. And that's what's happening in both of these kind of mechanisms that you can use now. So the first mechanism is called the Overseas NGO Registration. You'll hear a lot of different phrasing there, but essentially what this is the foreign nonprofit is opening an office in China and registering as an official office in China. And basically what you have to do as a foreign office there is you have to, on December 31st of each year, submit a complete activity plan to the government of what you plan to undertake during the following year. So they're then reviewing and approving those plans, and then you can carry on your activities through that year. And if a new activity comes up during that year, you really have to wait. And if it wasn't something that was already approved, of course, then you have to wait until December 31st of that year to submit that plan and then have it approved for the following year. So it's a helpful tool because you don't have kind of some of the per activity requirements that the next that the temporary license, which is the next option, requires, but it does really require you to think ahead and have all of your activities planned, which in some circumstances is difficult and may be impossible. So that's the office requirement. And then, of course, you have to report back on those activities so that they see what you've actually done and ensure compliance based on what they approved. So the temporary licenses is a bit different because it doesn't require foreign donors, to register as an office as in the first option. But what it does is you're required to submit to the government with that local Chinese nonprofit partner an application to receive a license to complete each activity that you want to undertake with that organization. So, for example, when we, CAF America, have a grant that we want to make into China, what we do is we work with the grantee partner and submit an application to the government to complete that activity in their province. And then, from there we receive approval and we can fund the activity after we receive that license. So this, for us, in our position as an intermediary, has been a very effective tool, and we've received many temporary licenses thus far and are continuing our grant making into China with this license. It is certainly onerous because, of course, it requires us to submit quite an extensive amount of documentation for each license that we receive, and requires us to have be in very close contact with that nonprofit partner to help them get everything they need together to complete the license. But I have to say that over time, of course, this has been in place since January 2017 now, we're seeing things get a little bit easier. I think, first of all, in the sense that previously, a lot of charities weren't aware of this law and weren't aware of how to comply with it, but now we're seeing kind of wider adoption and understanding of the law. So that's been really helpful, I think, in the recent licenses. And it can take some time, and patience and kind of clerical organization as far as being able to produce all of the documents that are required. But it's overall, this is the route that CAF America has taken, and it's been pretty effective, and we've been able to continue our work there. Maybe with some time delays to add this license application process on, but really it's been overall fairly effective. The law overall makes the nonprofit work more visible and transparent, and provides legitimacy to some of the activities that were previously unregulated. You need to be careful in your applications overall about funding certain sensitive topics and things like that. There are certain types of activities that have not been approved for these licenses thus far, and it's hard to say if that's because not many are applying to participate in those activities or if they're actually being rejected. But LGBTQ activities would be one that haven't really received many approved licenses. for example. So you still need to be sensitive to what activities you're undertaking in the country. So that's China. I'm sure if some of you work in China, you probably have a lot of questions aside from what I just presented, but I'm happy to talk more, or you can send questions through the chat. Because I know it's been a very difficult issue for people, for different funders since that law has started. But we're feeling very positive about it as we've really been able to continue our work there. So the next case I want to focus on briefly is in Mexico. And this is also discussed in the Lilly School report as well. Mexico in their index has a score of 3.47, so a little bit higher than China in that regard. But we're, of course, seeing a lot of issues in civil society in Mexico that are hindering the efforts of the nonprofit and charitable sector there, as well as, civil society in general. In Mexico, and then all of these issues also, of course, contribute to our ability to give cross-border into the country and how certain donors are reacting to the issues there. So civil society restrictions in Mexico can take several forms. One is in just pure violence. So, you probably have seen in the news, but there have been many murders of journalists, 12 in just 2017 alone, and we've certainly seen that continue into 2018. That is a pervasive and difficult issue in Mexico right now. I would say one of the items that has happened in the last several years that affects cross-border giving specifically and the most is comes from the Financial Action Task Force recommendations, that for a long time said that charities were particularly vulnerable to money laundering and terrorism, and that more regulations needed to be put around charities. That kind of message from the Financial Action Task Force has since been taken back, but this law, nevertheless, in Mexico still stands, where basically there's regulation on what charities have to collect from their donors in order to prove that they've that they know their donors and have conducted to an extent some donor due diligence on their donors. But basically, for example, when CAF America makes a grant into Mexico of over $10,000 US, we have to submit a wide variety of documents about us, so our governing structure, our governing documents, registration, things like that, and including even the passport, a copy of our CEO's passport, which I think for many donors is one of the most sensitive areas, because we've heard, since this law passed several years ago, donors have come to us saying, well, this is something we can't or we don't feel comfortable providing to Mexican charities, which is of course understandable. Sending a copy of your passport into Mexico is not always the most comfortable area, but we are doing this and sending it via encrypted email and things like that. But it enabled our grantees in Mexico to stay in compliance with their local laws. And part of what we view our role in this regard as an intermediary is educating them that if they don't ask us for it, this is what they need to collect from us in order to stay in compliance with their local laws. So I'd say, as far as cross-border giving into Mexico, this is a particularly important piece that we've seen affect the sector in the recent years. So then, there are several other topics in Mexico that create some level of difficulty in just being a nonprofit organization there. So just generally, the tax-exempt status, so it's called donataria autorizada, is difficult to receive, and it can easily be lost. So there are many ways that you can fall out of compliance, and falling out of compliance results in a loss of all assets. of the organization, which is, of course, a real threat. And there's some of the things that they're required to do each year is, renew their status as a tax-exempt organization, which is onerous and of course, costs staff time. And then there's monthly reporting that they're required to submit to the government, which requires more, extensive staff time and resources that many smaller nonprofits can't afford. So this has been an issue in Mexico as far as becoming and remaining compliant with your obligations as a tax-exempt organization. So we're seeing, because of this, a lot of organizations are choosing not to register as tax-exempt nonprofit entities, and sometimes to external donors that might not understand the issues there, that can seem to be, not maybe an organization that they don't want to fund because they want to make sure that they're funding tax-exempt nonprofit entities. But it's important as a foreign donor to have an understanding of some of these challenges and to understand and maybe be, empathetic to why they might not be registering fully in that way. And it's something where in the U.S. we use expenditure responsibility in these cases. I know that's kind of getting into a bit of detail, so if anyone has any questions about what I mean by that, I'm happy to chat offline about that. But there are different ways that you can still fund organizations in Mexico that aren't registered as tax-exempt entities, of course. So overall, those were just 2 case studies, but of course we work globally. So if you're having any issues in any particular challenging country, we're happy to help with that and help talk through different options there. But here are just some general tools that we recommend when working with challenging countries and challenging grantees in particular. If you're a corporation, and you have employee resources on the ground, I always recommend that you loop those employees in and work with them as much as you can. They often understand those local contexts and in a way that can be really helpful in navigating these challenging situations. So if you have people on the ground, I'd say that's a really great resource you should work with. In some cases, when cross-border funding is difficult or impossible in some areas, we're seeing some that are working with local in-country funds versus internationally based funds. We were seeing that a bit in China in the beginning, for example. So that's another way you could manage some of these challenges. Asking the right questions to ensure compliance with foreign funding laws. So as I mentioned earlier, some of these laws, when they come out, charities aren't really educated on them and don't know how to navigate them. So it's important to ask them questions about, what they're doing and to understand the issues yourself, so you know what you need to provide in order to make sure they're compliant. Because of course, the last thing you want is for a grant that you give to them to get them in trouble or lead to a regulatory issue locally for them. So just make sure you're asking the right questions and helping them comply. In that, this is really taking kind of the flexibility and partnership approach. I think some grantees, some relationships, we tend to only collect documents and due diligence verifications from them, but know that this might be a two-way road and they need as much information from you as the donor as you need from them in order to comply with some of their local laws. So just keep that in mind. Another tool is, of course, working with an intermediary like CAF America, and we can help kind of navigate some of these challenges. Utilizing expenditure responsibility, which is a bit more flexible than equivalency determination, and this is very U.S.-centric as far as actually giving cross-border grants. And then just being creative, responsive, and flexible to your grantees is kind of another way of managing these challenging markets. And Sarah, with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Jessie, for that presentation. As a reminder, if you have any questions for Jessie, you can send them to us in the Q&A box. We can also send the list of tools that she just showed a few minutes ago. Our next speaker is from the Arab Foundations Forum. which is a nonprofit membership-based association of philanthropic foundations in the Arab region. Our last presenter for the day is Naila Faruqi, who's the executive director of this organization. She's based in Cairo, Egypt, and in this position, she extensively travels in the region. She will be sharing with you some of her experiences and challenges working here. And without further ado, I will bring up her presentation and pass it on to you, Naila. You might have to.
Sorry, I was just having some trouble with the mute. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so I'll get started just very briefly to give you a little bit of a background on who we are. The Arab Foundations Forum, or the AFF, is a nonprofit membership-based association of Arab donors and Arab philanthropic foundations that work throughout the region. We have approximately 40 members to date in 11 countries. 8 of those countries are in the Arab region, and the remaining 3 are outside of the region, in the UK, the US, and Austria. And essentially, we serve as a hub for networking, knowledge sharing, capacity development for our members and our network. We aim to foster dialogue, to foster collaboration opportunities among our network in an effort to bolster the capacity and the efficacy of strategic philanthropy across the Arab region. The next slide is just a brief kind of overview of our pillars, our strategic pillars. They include communication, outreach, advocacy on behalf of the sector. Networking obviously is kind of a core pillar. Membership benefits and capacity development, and knowledge and resource. So this slide just kind of shows you a brief or a map of the Arab region. So the Arab region comprises 22 countries. Which makes up about 10% of the world's geography, with a population of about approximately 390 million, and a youth population across the region that is almost 50% below the age of 25. So a very, very a big burgeoning youth bulge across the region. So that's kind of an overview of the region itself. And when it comes to philanthropy in the Arab region, so philanthropy has a very long history in the region, right? And also a community and shared community behavior. So this is not something that's new to the region. So I always laugh when people ask me to talk about the nascent and developing sector of philanthropy in the Arab region, because in fact, the oldest act of philanthropy that was ever recorded is considered to have been recorded in Morocco, and it was recorded in the form of a waqf, or an endowment, founded by a woman as a university. So there is a very long-standing tradition of philanthropic giving and philanthropy across the region. Some of the more traditional forms of Arab philanthropy, just kind of to give you the context of, a glossary. Waqf is loosely translated as an endowment. Zakat, or alms and charitable giving, which is one of the 3rd pillars of Islam and is obligatory for believers. And sadaqah, which is a benevolent or voluntary giving and differs from zakat in that it's not obligatory. Along with these more traditional forms, we've been seeing some emerging trends in philanthropic giving across the region, which include institutionalized family and corporate foundations, support for more sustainable solutions with social impact and social return on investment, and impact investing. That we've been sort of seeing a bit more of that. We still see that some of the top causes are focused around achieving social change, and we saw more of that post-2011 and the geopolitical sort of uprisings around 2011. And then we're also seeing an emerging trend around legacy or planned giving, some of which are waqf, and some that are not necessarily. Some of the other, you'll see in this chart, which is, just a quick snapshot. And if you look at the Middle East region or the Arab region, we see that some of the, top motivations around giving still remain within religious faith. We know that some of the top sectors that are receiving the most kind of funding is around health and social change. Geographically, the Arab region tends to give more locally and regionally, and actually even regionally is becoming more and more restricted. So it really is a lot more local. And the best types of collaboration, or the most popular types of collaboration that we're seeing, is around peer-to-peer. We're still not seeing enough of that kind of, large-scale partnerships. In comparison, if we look at Arab philanthropy, or here it's categorized as Middle East, but Arab philanthropy, in relation to Asia and or Europe, you can see that, driven by religious faith is a very, very high percentage. Focused on social change is also a relatively high percentage. The 60% insisting on anonymity is an interesting one, and that's very much cultural. And so these were just some kind of basic questions that were asked by UNHCR around, in these three regions, around some of the emerging trends with philanthropy and philanthropic giving. The next slide, when it comes to fundraising, some of the emerging trends that we're seeing around fundraising in the region still include the more traditional asks that we know of, so person to person, community to community. We see that there's more and more where communities are seeking endorsements to solicit faith-based funding. We are seeing some opportunities around partnership, but again, they tend to remain a bit more regional and local. We are seeing definitely a big move towards going digital with some restrictions, because there are still restrictions around crowdfunding. There's still some issues with credit card payments online. PayPal, for instance, is banned in some countries across the region. So that's, it's in some cases it's a lot more popular than others. We are seeing that there's kind of the honorary title giving and recognition opportunities for those who are either celebrities or in certain positions to be able to assist in fundraising. Obviously events to advocate and raise awareness, but again, with some restrictions. It always depends obviously on what the topic is, what the advocacy is, just related to some issues with government and restrictions around that. So for example, if you were trying to host an event in Egypt, for instance, you wouldn't be able to host anything around democracy or governance. You certainly wouldn't be able to advocate for anything like that. And then, we're looking at networking opportunities as well that are kind of becoming more and more popular. The next slide is a little bit, we've sort of done a bit of a SWOT analysis. It's not completely comprehensive, but it does sort of touch on some of the main issues that we've seen in the region. So when we start with the strengths, we know that the geopolitical transition across the region has meant that there's more of an increased awareness of the possibility and the potential for change, and the potential power of civil society and philanthropy. We know that this burgeoning youth bulge across the region means that there is a current and a future generation of change makers that need to be harnessed, although they have not been, but need to be. We know that there's wealth across the region. So we know that we have capital that can be deployed, even though much of that wealth is concentrated in certain areas and is not necessarily region-wide. The long-standing tradition of giving means that there's this embedded culture and this will to give towards social change and philanthropic causes. And the increasing awareness and the readiness to implement some more cutting edge, some more innovative ways of giving, i.e. crowdfunding, legacy giving, et cetera, exists around the creation of more strategic philanthropic practices. On the other hand, some of the weaknesses that we acknowledge, we tend to have a lack of strategic planning. So anything beyond 3 to 5 years is not really the norm. We tend to have a lack of forensic accounting of crises and looking at ways to mitigate challenges. So that ultimately means that our impact is thwarted. The interventions tend to be very short term, so they're not necessarily sustainable, and they're not always very strategic. They can also tend to be a little bit ad hoc. This uneven distribution of wealth across the region obviously means that there's a decreased opportunity for collaboration and cooperation among Arab donors. The lack of data, which is huge for us, and the lack of knowledge sharing and the will to collaborate, but also the means to collaborate. So a lot of regional restrictions mean that collaboration tends to be very difficult. So that obviously diminishes the potential for maximum impact. And then generally speaking, again, we have a pretty weak infrastructure within the region. So that means that there's a lack of support for the implementation of some of the more cutting edge and innovative ways to bolster philanthropic giving and engagement across borders. Which then takes us to some of the opportunities. There's an interest among Arab philanthropists in the region to explore some of the new and more global trends in giving. So whether it's strategic philanthropy, venture philanthropy, impact, et cetera, et cetera. And that's been allowing for an opportunity to engage philanthropists in a new way, even if they're not necessarily always able to implement or to activate. There's an access to a more global platform, whether that's via social media networks, et cetera. And that's, you know, as much as some of our governments try to squash that or quell it, people are finding ways around it. So that's been allowing for an ease of sharing information and knowledge, and particularly for a younger and more cyber engaged population across the region, of which anyway, the Arab region enjoys about 48% of a population under the age of 25. And then there's a shared interest, both regionally and globally, in trying to combat this current rise in radicalization. And so this has meant that there's an opportunity to collaborate and engage in some of these innovative ways to provide alternatives to the Arab region's youth, to create more long-term sustainable models of giving and creating impact. And then that takes us to the threats. So, you know, it's like obviously all the strengths, all the weaknesses, all the opportunities and the threats are all somehow interrelated, and they tend to be, you know, opposite sides of the same coin. This disenfranchised youth population means that there's an increased frustration and an inclination towards radicalization, or an ease in radicalizing this huge population of youth. We have regional governments that are relatively unreliable. They're relatively inconsistent in terms of the policies and the laws that govern our sector. And this means that our environment is unpredictable. It doesn't allow us for long-term planning and strategic development because things turn on a dime, policies change overnight, governments change overnight. Look at the case of Egypt, two governments taken down in the span of 3 years. The growing restrictions across the sector, which also include restrictions for international organizations, have forced many of the international NGOs to close down and leave the region, which has left many local NGOs who had served as partners and implementers with a lot of unfinished and unfunded interventions that are necessary, but have been essentially abandoned. And then just an increasing mistrust among regional governments has meant that a lot of cross-border giving and a lot of this inter-regional giving has been halted, if it's not forbidden altogether. Thank you very much. I'll hand it back over to Sarah, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Naila, for your sensitive presentation. So we are a bit over the time. So I'm going to ask one question, and then we've received a few other questions, and we'll send these to the presenters to ask via email. I hope that's okay. So one of the questions that I have for you, Naila, Kinga, and Una, someone asked to know if you have any insights on the restrictions for online donations. Has there been any research here? Have you heard anything? Have you seen anything regarding restrictions to online donations?
While there isn't a comprehensive research publication on restrictions to online giving, I would encourage the participants to actually go to our website for the global indices, Global Philanthropy Indices, and look at the country reports, because we do have each country and each region, there's a report on them, and each country report highlights whether there are particular restrictions about online giving. I will mention that the bigger challenge facing online giving, especially in Europe and to some extent North America, are some of the new data registration requirements that the European Union has passed recently. And we see that some nonprofits are trying to comply with that, and that is having an impact on their donations. That's highlighted in, say, the report, country report for the UK, and to some extent some of the other European countries. Kinga, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
No, I agree with you, and I know, but I think Nela could add some more information that there are some restrictions in the Arab world too in terms of online fundraising and online giving.
Yeah, so actually, I mean, generally speaking, and I mean, this may differ from country to country, but generally speaking, it's very difficult to solicit online donations, either because it's illegal, or because people aren't very comfortable putting their credit cards online. And then in many cases, there are also credit cards in parts of the region are not equipped to be used for online debit. And then in some other cases, for instance, like, you know, I know, for example, and this gets a little bit tricky in terms of territory, because if you're making a donation, for instance, to a Jordanian entity, it's not legal for to host a fundraiser in Jordan. So you have to have a special royal decree permission to be able to fundraise in Jordan outside of grants. And in our case, for example, membership fees. So it would be illegal. But I don't know if that depends on where the bank account is. I don't know if that depends on, you know, where the organization is registered, where the website is registered. So that can get a little bit tricky in that kind of cyber world. But for the most part, it's not, I mean, crowdfunding and online funding is not a huge platform that's being used.
Thank you for answering that question. We're getting a lot of really great questions coming in, but I'm afraid we've run out of time. Our apologies. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you again for our impressive speakers for passing on some of your knowledge and experiences to us. If you have any questions for our speakers, I'd be happy to connect them to you, or we can send you the answers that have been answered by them after the call, like typing. We thank you for your discretion for some of the more sensitive topics you might have heard here today. My email is on the screen. If you have any questions, please send them there. And lastly, WINGS is hosting a webinar with the EFC about FATF, which has come up a few times on this call, the Financial Action Task Force. My colleague Maida has just sent you the link to register for the call. It's on October 17th, and we hope you join us then. Thank you for joining us here today.